Joining me now here on the Knicks Film School pregame show with the Knicks welcoming in the Charlotte Hornets for a Sunday matinee at MSG. We went back down to our good friends at the Buzzbeat podcast and welcome back to a returning guest, Mr. Richie Randall. Richie, I've never called you Rich, I don't think. Richie, is that what you go by? Mostly Richie?
I go by Richie. Some people have called me Rich before.
Who calls you Rich?
Just random friends.
Okay.
My family doesn't call me Rich.
Oh, wow. So, literally nobody calls you Rich then. So I apologize. This is the last time we're going to call you Rich here on this podcast. We'll stick with Richie. And I'm excited to call you my co-host for today to talk about this basketball team that I am having a hard time figuring out how to project. And I figure I'll ask a Hornets fan and a Hornets podcaster and content creator what they think, because you look at their schedule, what's looking like a more and more impressive win in Atlanta on opening night, or I guess at home against Atlanta on opening night. Right. An impressive win down the stretch against Indiana, which Indiana's looking more and more impressive as the days go by. And then there's some bad losses like the one in Brooklyn and the one in Detroit and the one in Washington, or I guess at home against Washington. And I'm sure you see what the schedule, at least over the next 5 games, looks like with the Knicks, Miami, Milwaukee, the Knicks again in Boston. And I guess my first question for you about the Hornets going into this year, because I had no idea where to put them in preseason predictions. What was the expectations going into this year? There's a lot of uncertainty during the offseason about what this team would be. So how did you approach this upcoming season?
I am typically more on the realistic / pessimistic side when it comes to projecting where they would go. I think some optimistic Hornets fans out there were expecting maybe this team, the health gets back into shape and everyone clicks on all cylinders. Brandon Miller plays well. The Miles Bridges situation, if he came back and played well, he could potentially make it into a top 8 seed, maybe even before, the play-in. I'm talking about, they were the 8th seed overall, and then they had to win their way into the playoffs. My kind of range for them always kind of existed around the 10, 11, 12 range, but potentially even falling down to 13 and 14. The only team that I ever considered below the Hornets, heading into the season, was the Wizards. I was confident that team was not going to pass the Hornets. Now, obviously they did just beat the Hornets on Wednesday, but then the Hornets got them back on Friday night. Actually, that was, I guess, a more important win as it was a play-in game, or not a play-in game, an in-season tournament game.
Yeah.
So, the expectations have been all over the place. I think the health has been, the biggest question mark heading into the season, and whether or not LaMelo can, play 70 plus games, because he has been injured the past couple of seasons. And then just Clifford, just making sure that this team plays well defensively. And so if all things went right, Andrew, yes, they could be a top 8, 9, 10 seed in that play-in range. But I've always felt that they were 10, 11, 12.
I think I ended up with them around 10 or 11 in my preseason predictions. And you're right that the LaMelo aspect of this, he got his extension this offseason. So that question and conversation is out the door. But you look at what he's done so far this year. And while, you're right, he's back on the court and playing, I see the efficiency numbers. I do see where he lands in usage, but he does have a good on-off so far this year. To the uneducated Knicks fan that hasn't watched a lot of Hornets, how has LaMelo played so far this season?
He started off a little slow, but he has picked things up recently, and he's been starting to put it together. Yeah, the on-off numbers are going to be crazy with LaMelo just because of the backup point guard position and just the way that the team struggles a lot when he's off the court. This team, they definitely have to stagger players. And you need that starting unit to play as much as you can. But you just can't afford to do that because you can't do wholesale changes when LaMelo and Hayward and Brandon Miller, some of the better distributors, are off the court. This team just plummets tremendously. But in terms of an individual basis for LaMelo, I think the one thing that you're going to see in this game, or just one thing that you might see a little bit more of this season, is the rim pressure. Because he's always been a guy that has lived outside the arc, which he's a good 3-point shooter. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I think that that's always going to be a part of his game. But one thing that I've theorized over the past couple of seasons is that he did not get to the rim as much. I guess his rookie season when he was healthy, because of the health and kind of overcoming those mental hurdles. Man, if I go attack this rim and get, blasted by the center, am I going to land on my ankle wrong? So, I think that's one thing that you're going to start to see a little bit more of in this game, trying to get downhill as much as possible. And I think with LaMelo, that's going to open up a ton of things in terms of dribble and drive and kick. Like, he's still a top-notch distributor, and he's a guy that's been proven to make shots in that floater range as well. And then I guess one thing too, Andrew, is like, he is a guy that obviously likes to have the ball in his hands, but he can play off ball as well. Like, give the ball up, let him go relocate for a three. So I think, the health and kind of overcoming those mental hurdles for LaMelo is going to be the biggest thing. Defensively, it's still kind of a give and take. You'll see points where his length comes into play and he gets deflections and steals. Other times he gets blown by his defender, or his opponent. So LaMelo has been, a guy that's steadily kind of picked up the pace, and the on-off numbers, like you mentioned, are always going to be there because the second unit is just so bad.
So Maladon is the backup point guard at the moment, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
I thought the last time I came on this conversation with the podcast, and just like we talked about the same thing, like the Hornets don't have a backup point guard.
Well, it was DSJ last year, former Knick, Dennis Smith Jr., and he was like, his defensive numbers were outstanding, but you kind of took us behind the curtain that those are great defensive numbers. He's not that great a backup point guard. At least when you were here last year.
I take him back in a heartbeat right now.
Well, the devil, right? So Brandon Miller, we did a draft live stream, which is in hindsight a bit weird because the Knicks didn't have a pick. And shout out to our draft guru, Chris Persianen, who did so much research. And the thought was like, the Knicks are going to trade into this draft. They're going to be active on draft night. And we got like 45 picks in, and he's still like giving all of his information about prospects. And it's like, I don't think the Knicks are going to do anything tonight, man. But one of the initial shocks was that Scoot didn't go number 2. And I because the Knicks played the Hawks already, I watched the Hornets Hawks opening night game, and I saw that fourth quarter flurry from Miller when he hit a couple of threes. Admittedly, that's like kind of all I've seen of Brandon Miller so far this season. I did see you go at 5 of 16 last night in the game against the Wizards, at the tournament game, as you mentioned. So how would you grade Brandon Miller through, admittedly, the smallest of sample size that you ever want to give a grade on anybody? But let's start. What was your reaction draft night, and what is your thoughts on him so far?
I'm not a big draft guy like you, so I don't really do a lot of digging deep into those types of players, whether it's the G League or whether it's overseas or whether it's college players. I did not have a lot of information going into it. I will say my co-hosts were very Scoot heavy. They leaned that way. I don't know if it was just like the upside, the athleticism, and kind of what he could turn into. I don't know if it was the controversy surrounding him at Alabama, and whether that was going to be something else added to the Hornets' plate with Miles Bridges. But I think when you see a 6'9" guy that can play multiple positions, can affect the game on both ends of the court, and then can shoot the ball really well, you would hope that he's a top 2, top 3 prospect heading in. I actually didn't necessarily have a strong preference. I probably still lean Scoot, but out of all the co-hosts, I probably was more open to the idea about Brandon Miller. And I would say, 8 games into the season, B+. That's kind of how I would grade him. I think his 3-point shooting numbers have not been the best so far, but I think that's only going to go up over time. I think this team desperately needs 3-point shooting, especially with Terry Rozier injured right now. It's pretty much all LaMelo Ball. But I think the biggest thing that I've noticed with Miller, and I think Steve Clifford has talked about this as well, is for a rookie, he just plays so calm. Like nothing can speed him up. When he gets the ball, it's not like the extra pressure is going to make him do something that he shouldn't. He's not going to turn the ball over at a high rate. And so right now, because the 3-point shot's not falling, he's still adding stuff to this team. His mid-range shooting is there. He's a good passer. When he gets inside the arc, he can draw in defenders and he can make that dump down pass to the big. And then, just with his length on defense, being 6'9", he can affect the game on that end with steals and blocks and just being able to be in the general range to contest shots. So I think the 3-point numbers will come with time. But I think even if that's not there for the first half of the season and maybe come All-Star break, you start to see that pick up a little bit. He's still going to affect the game in other ways. And I think right now with the way that Scoot hasn't been performing, a lot of people are like, oh, wow, Brandon Miller should have been the pick at number 2.
Yeah, the smallest of sample size overreactions. We're getting some of that too in New York, whether it be the poor start from Julius Randle or the hot start from RJ Barrett. This is the time to get your early takes in as best you can. Not just takes, early conclusions in before we have 70 more basketball games. Although, let people enjoy things, as I always say.
My favorite thing is, Andrew, when when it fits your agenda, you'll say that it works, but then if it doesn't, be like, oh, just give it time. Just give it time.
Sample size. Exactly. Otherwise, but otherwise, of course, RJ Barrett was always going to be this. I shouldn't say that. I've actually really enjoyed what RJ's been so far this year. So as much as I'm teasing the overreactions to a small sample size, there is a hint of like, oh my gosh, you figured it out. Like, he's efficient. He's making smarter passes. He's seeing the court better. He's playing defense. Like, there is an actual hope that this is here to stay. But a lot of basketball left to play. Speaking of a lot of basketball left to play, I led this asking you about your expectations going into this year. Not that you can speak for the entire fan base, but if you had to take the temperature of the fan base in Charlotte, what does a disappointing Hornet season look like? Is it like, would they be okay with the lottery pick and maybe a trade for an asset before the deadline? Or is there some stakes on this year that some winning has to be done?
I think on the whole, most people want this team to win. Most people want this team to make the playoffs in some sort of fashion. I think from a practical point of view, making the playoffs is probably not worth it because you're going to get swept in the first round. But yeah, I think that would be a disappointing season for most Hornets fans, just not making the play-in / playoffs. And I think this whole ownership change, Steve Clifford uncertainty, Mitch Kupchak, the GM, these all could be their last year because the owners could feel like, okay, we want our own coach. We want our own GM. We are kind of frustrated or impatient with the way that things are going. And it's not going to be something that happens overnight, but it almost feels like a lot of these front office people are kind of like lame duck situations where this could be their last year, make or break. And I do think that, Steve Clifford overall has been good for this team, I guess, for more from a culture point of view and being a physical defensive team. We saw last year when, Mark Williams came in and he was able to elevate this defense and Clifford just rubs off on people when it comes to that end of the court. But also, by the same breath, you don't want to waste these years with LaMelo Ball. You want to form a team around him that can compete on a consistent level. So that's kind of how I would answer it, Andrew. I think that most Hornets fans are kind of fed up and frustrated and impatient. If you're in this area, Panthers aren't doing well. Now the Hornets aren't doing well. They need some winning to go on. But also by the same token, it's getting into the playoffs and getting swept by the Bucks or the Celtics. It's just not going to be very fun to watch, or is it going to really result in a lottery pick either? So
I guess the how really matters in how your playoff exit goes. It was a couple of years ago with the Pelicans were the 9 seed and they won their play-in, their 9-10 play-in. They were under 500, 10 games under 500. They won their 9-10. Then Paul George got COVID and missed the 8-9 play-in game. They won that, and then they took the Suns to 6 games, and it was this really encouraging 6-game series without Zion. And it was okay, it was a 10-game under 5. It was a 36-win season, but you can build off of this. And then there are other versions where, like you said, you're a 35 win team that is a 10 seed and loses that, or you're an 8 seed that gets swept. Even maybe that's kind of a myth that the play-in creates. I don't know what you think, but it used to be that if you just made the 8th seed and got swept, that was a disappointing season. Now, if you're the 8th seed, you probably won 2 games to make it to the play-in, or at least won a play-in game that adds, like the Heat, they got rolling last year because they won an 8-9 play-in game, and then that led them into the Bucks. So maybe it's more of a momentum creator. So what happens if the disappointing season happens in Charlotte? And do you see them cleaning house?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can see it happening. I could see that happening. Like I said, I'm a fan of Clifford in a certain sense, but I don't know if the owners are going to have much patience for the fact that, hey, we're going to do one more year of Clifford, one more year of Mitch Kupchak. I do think that they'll probably clean house and try to, switch some things up. I think with Hayward's numbers coming off the book, and they have a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but they're probably in the top 5, top 10 when it comes to potential available salary available for this upcoming offseason. And they can make things work that way. So it feels like it could be a clean slate next season with personnel, but also with coaching. But who knows? We've seen crazier things happen.
This is Gordon Hayward's last year on the contract, right? He's expiring deal.
Yes, that is correct. And
do you see him on the team past the deadline?
See, that's an interesting question, because I think he has probably been, if you had to ask me, one of the more underrated players this year for the Hornets, and top 3, I mean, 8 games, Andrew, but top 3 players on this team. He continues to be a guy that, when healthy, very impactful in the mid-range. His presence is so smooth in that area. Just go watch him in the latest game against Washington and how ridiculous and how easily that comes to him. And he's an underrated player when it comes to passing the ball, a ball mover, and just kind of making the right pass. So 1, he is impactful for Charlotte. 2, his value right now, because he's not injured, is high. So could you turn that into a potential trade? But the problem with that is that because his salary is so high, you would have to throw in several players just to kind of make that match. And so is that going to be worth it in the end if they're attaching, I guess, longer term pieces? And everything that I've heard is that Gordon likes it here in Charlotte, at least the area. His family is kind of settling down here. So could he take a discount next year to come back and play? So I think it's going to be one of those things where they kind of monitor his health heading into January and February, and probably take it down to the last possible second before they make that decision. I don't see them trading him in December or anything like that. But yeah, he could come back. And I think if the money is right, it would make a ton of sense just to kind of use him as a mentor to Brandon Miller, because the way that they use Miller and Hayward are very similar right now because of the fact that Miller's shot's not falling.
Yeah, I reminded myself as I was asking that, I'm asking about a deadline question, and it's, again, 8 games into the season. So we have no idea what the Hornets will be at that point in the year. But I think more than anybody, maybe Terry Rozier, but it's those 2 guys that have been mentioned in every single, I think the first time we had you on the Knicks Film School pod was in the summer of trying to trade Julius Randle. And it was a Gordon Hayward and Terry Rozier for Randall and Rose swap. It was something like that. Yeah. And back then you were like, yeah, because the Knicks need a backup point guard named Derrick Rose. And lo and behold, you went with Dennis Smith Jr. as the backup. So I'll be curious to see how the season plays out, and if they do kind of sell off their veterans to go closer to the top of the lottery, or if, like you said, they need some veterans in the building to make sure Miller has some kind of veteran leadership there. I got to be honest, I completely forgot Michael Jordan sold his stake in the team, that he's no longer the majority owner, until you just mentioned it. I do remember when it happened. I was a bit busy this summer, but when that happened, I know we talked about it last year when you were on the pod, what it's like to have Michael Jordan as the owner, and how it's a much different perspective from a Charlotte Hornets fan. So when that news happened, how was that met by Charlotte Hornets fans?
I would say 90% of the people liked the news, I guess. I guess if you want to say it that way.
Rejoiced. Rejoiced. Okay.
10%, I think, just like the allure of MJ in the building. I guess he's still minority owner. I guess he still has a stake in the team. But the fact that he's not majority and making all the big moves and kind of taking a step back, just with his track record with this team, he's not been successful over the course of his tenure here in Charlotte. So, having just a change of pace, it feels like it can only go up from here. And, I think some of the moves he made just didn't make a ton of sense. Like sometimes he would overpay players that shouldn't, or he would let guys go that probably should have been brought back. He was stingy in certain areas. And just when it all came down to it, the on-court product just did not match his on-court product. Obviously, like he was such a competitive guy that, had a short leash with some of these players and just wanted to make things right away. And I think sometimes making those quick decisions where you're not looking down the road, it can hurt you down the road and tie things up. And so, yeah, I think for the most part, most people did not care that he's out of the building and we've got new guys in. We don't know much about these new guys. We'll see what they do next year. I think because the sale was so late and because, it was finalized later in the summer, this season feels like kind of this like hybrid year that it's Michael Jordan's guys up in the front office, Michael Jordan's guys on the court. But transitioning to next year, like we mentioned, it could be a different story.
As someone who just doesn't know who the new owners are Hornets fans excited about even though it sounds like it's going to be a bit of a transition year. And look, we're rivals when it comes to baseball. You know how the Mets were when Steve Cohen took over, and it was like a wait and see, and who knows what eventually happens with that franchise. But there was optimism when he took over the team that first year. So I ask, as the fan of a team who has a new owner, is there optimism that things are now on the up and up?
I guess. Yeah. Like the new owners are Gabe Plotkin and Rick Schnall. Rick Schnall used to be a minority owner with the Hawks, and obviously he had to sell that portion to come over here. I would say, like, generally speaking, in the Charlotte area, there's not a ton of optimism just because of the way the sports scene has gone. But I think just making the change and just for like the small period of time, there's some optimism. Like just until things start to go wrong, we don't have a lot of patience here. We don't have a lot of patience here in Charlotte. And I don't blame fans because there just hasn't been a ton of winning seasons. Like since we started the podcast, we haven't had a playoff series.
Oh man.
We started 7 years ago, probably to the day or, to this week. And we started the year after the Hornets made the playoffs thinking, oh, we could just ride this and, get some playoff series podcasts. Like we're like yearning to do a playoff podcast. We haven't been able to do that. So it's been a while. And I guess the Hornets have been the longest drought, I guess, in the NBA in terms of a team that's made the playoffs. So yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of optimism just because of the track record with everything that goes on. But I guess because it's a new face, new owners, you kind of give them the benefit of the doubt. But who knows?
That was the Heat series, right? The one that went 7 where Wade went off in Game 6.
Yes, I believe so. Yes. You are correct.
Yeah, there was like a guy sitting courtside that he was like getting into it with.
Yeah. The Hornets won Game 5 on the road, came back home to try to wrap things up at Game 6, and that just didn't happen. And then when the Hornets went to Miami for Game 7, we knew that wasn't going to be a game that we could steal.
Yeah. Listen, as somebody who roots for a team that went through a long time without seeing the playoffs, I empathize with that situation. So hopefully things are on the up and up for Charlotte. I want to ask you an evergreen question before I get to the part where I ask you what you think about the Knicks. And what I've been doing with my guests this year, Richie, is like here in New York, we have certain rivalries that we hold dear. And we circle dates on the calendar the moment it shows up. The Hornets, unfortunately, are not one of them. But I'm curious what other teams do when the schedule comes out and what other fan bases look forward to. So if you had to name the Mount Rushmore, so obviously there's history involved, but the 4 biggest rivals for Hornets fans, like the 4 teams that, okay, like they're on the schedule, I'm circling these dates, who would they be?
I would think, well, a lot of these are probably like divisional opponents, but I would think my Hawks would be number one. I think
Hawks are number one. Okay.
Hawks, yeah. I think proximity plays a role there. The Trae Young aspect, he gets under the skin. Well, he gets under the skin of a lot of teams, especially the Knicks.
It runs in the family here. Okay.
In the family. The way that he just, looks for the fouls and stuff like that. And it just seems like there's always interesting battles when it comes to the Hornets and the Hawks. And one thing I found out, Andrew, I need to find it on my Twitter so I can show you. Supposedly, there is some kind of trophy that goes on between the Hornets and the Hawks. It's a trophy of a pig. It's called the BBQ Series, NBA series. Like I have never heard of this thing. They did a story on it, on opening night. Basically, if you win the series between the Hawks and the Hornets, you get this trophy. It has a big pig on it, I guess, because it's kind of like this Southern rivalry barbecue. It is the strangest thing that no one had heard of. And Ashley Shamedy, our sideline reporter, had found it just kind of like hanging out. Like, what is this trophy that we have here? So we are in current possession of this thing.
Oh my God. I'm staring right at it. It's like a bronze pig, the NBA, the BBQ Series, Atlanta, the Battle of the South.
That's what it is. The Battle of the South.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why we circle the calendar for the Hawks, because of that thing right there.
You got to win the pig. Yeah.
So I would say Hawks, number one. I would say number two, probably the Heat. A lot of what you mentioned there with some playoff, I wouldn't call it playoff rivalries, because the Heat have been beating us in these playoff series, even when it dates back to the Bobcats. That's number two. Number three, something about the Pacers. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's like the LaMelo Halliburton thing. Maybe that's just like a recency thing, but like something about that. It feels like that team has always been on a trajectory that's similar to the Hornets, but they've always been like a notch above. And so the Hornets are always trying to catch up to them and kind of be in the same realm as they are. In terms of the fourth one, I guess we can go Wizards, even though that they have been such a team that's like the Hornets, like on mediocrity. They always are trying to make moves to win, but they don't end up winning. So they're kind of stuck in this, like, picking 8, 9, 10 overall. So I would say those four. But definitely the Hawks. The Hawks, for whatever reason, just rub people the wrong way. And maybe a lot of it has to do with Trae Young.
Listen, there's no Battle of the South when the Knicks played Trae. That's just one playoff series that happened, and they've largely dominated Trae in the regular season. No one gets a trophy when the Knicks and Hawks play. This is the most fast. I'm going to read up on this on my Saturday now. The BBQ Series.
Well, the way that it's worded almost sounds as if there's other ones out there. Like it's right. Like NBA series. Like I don't know.
The Battle of the Boroughs. We should start that with the Nets. Although that would require people to care about that matchup. So 2 follow-ups to your Mount Rushmore. The first one, the Heat make a ton of sense because there's like a Jamal Mashburn thing that goes back to the late 90s and 2000s, because he went from the Heat to the Hornets, and I remember that 02 series. Well, I guess it was the 01 series where they were the 6th seed and they upset the Heat. It was he was playing his old team, and then they swept the Heat, and then they lost to the Bucks in the second round. Am I remembering that right?
I believe you are correct. I know there's been a lot of like battles back and forth between the Heat and the Hornets in those like mid to late 90s, early 2000s. That particular year, I remember the Bucks series. I don't remember necessarily what happened that first round.
Well, there's also the Alonzo Mourning factor Zoe went from the Hornets to the Heat, and then the rivalry I guess starts there. So so the Heat makes sense. I gotta say, maybe this is just my ignorance here. I would have thought, is there something there with New Orleans? So like when we had the Pelicans creator on, he said that he didn't mention the Hornets, but they took I don't know if they took your team. I don't know the history of the Hornets going to New Orleans, but how do you experience that?
What's weird, some fans actually moved over to become a New Orleans Hornets fan when there wasn't a team here in Charlotte. And maybe it was just one of those things. Hey, I'm going to be a fan of the Hornets until we get a team back in Charlotte. I don't think many people stuck with that team. I kind of am indifferent to the New Orleans Pelicans / Hornets. I don't think there's any animosity. Obviously, they took, our franchise and things like that, but they just, I think maybe because they're in the Western Conference, we don't see them as often. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. At least from my point of view, when we ever match up against them, it's just another game for us.
So it's not like Browns Ravens, where Browns fans hate the Ravens solely because they took their team and won 2 Super Bowls after taking their team. It's nothing like that. I guess because the Pelicans have won 1 playoff series since going there, it probably doesn't mean as much. Although the Chris Paul New Orleans team did get to the second round too. Yeah. So
I guess the only thing that maybe the Charlotte Hornets fans maybe hold something against New Orleans is when the year that they got the number 1 overall pick and took Anthony Davis, and the Hornets were stuck with not stuck, but they drafted MKG.
You could have said stuck. It would have been okay. I understand you're trying to be respectful, but
yeah, I was trying to be respectful.
Listen, CAA Kentucky client, we have respect for Michael Kidd-Gilchrist here in the New York area. Last question before I let you get out of here. It's where I turn the podcast over to my guest and ask them how you feel about the Knicks, and do you have any questions about the New York Knicks going into this matchup and for this season?
Yeah, I didn't realize the Knicks were 4-4. I thought maybe they would have been a little bit. 5-3 or 6-2. Just some of the things that I've heard about them this season. I've not watched too much of them. I've read up on them. I've listened to your podcast as well. One thing that I have noticed is, maybe I can ask you a question about this at the tail end of this, but Jalen Brunson, I've heard that he's not had the most consistent start, but he's always a guy that scares me with the ball in his hands. And because he can get to his spots, because he has some strength. He shows up in many ways on both ends of the court. I know that you mentioned that Julius Randle had a slow start to the season. And my biggest thing with Julius, it always has been, and maybe this is just from an outsider's point of view, is just making sure that he doesn't really turn into a black hole. Like he's passing the ball, he's making the right read. I think if he can do that, he just becomes 10 times more impactful. Because if you try to send extra help his way, he's going to make the correct pass, and then he can kind of feed off of that. I know that RJ Barrett has had a hot start, but I would love to know in what ways. I know that 3-point shooting is probably going to come down for him, but he's definitely playing within himself, scoring the ball. And then the one player that just keeps popping up when I hear about the Knicks is Mitchell Robinson. He is just a rebounding beast, bouncy guy. He can play on both ends of the court. I think the biggest matchup in this game between the Hornets and the Knicks is going to be between Mark Williams and Mitchell Robinson. I know that he's going to frustrate the Hornets in the pick and roll in terms of maybe even coming up to the level of the screen and maybe, frustrating LaMelo Ball there or, blocking shots at the rim. So I think the physicality there is going to be an interesting matchup because Knicks are awesome on the offensive glass and the Hornets are too, but Hornets are kind of the middle of the road when it comes to keeping opponents off the offensive glass. So I think that's going to be the key and try to limit the Knicks to these second chance points, which they are probably tops in the league to that. But yeah, I would love to know, what are you seeing out of RJ in terms of why his start has been so hot? And then maybe kind of speaking to Mitchell Robinson and Jalen.
So I'll take them one at a time. Man, the RJ Barrett experience has been a fascinating one. And I shout out to one of our staffers, XJ, who I thought kind of nailed it on a most recent podcast episode, that there's really no precedent for someone that has his first 4 years other than just blindly a 22-year-old getting better, right? You're allowed to expect that will happen. And I respect people that have always been in his corner for that belief, but there's no one with his poor efficiency and low impact to potentially negative impact that then takes a leap like this and is suddenly efficient, suddenly making positive impact plays. And it's across the board. He's passing better. He's playing better defense. He's recognizing that you don't have to take a shot on a pick and roll. You can look for someone on the weak side on a pass. You can be more creative in your process if you'd like to. And that honestly, you mentioned Julius making the right pass. RJ's he's made so many correct plays this year that it's turned him into, it's almost like you have a new weapon, and I was on the chase down when the Knicks played the Cavs, and obviously with the Knicks you get asked a bunch about the potential trade that they're going to make and will there be one in season. And I gotta say, like, it's only 8 games. I get it. Like, the small sample size is there, but I'm now at the point where I just wanted to see what this RJ Barrett thing is. Like, I need 82 games of this version of him that kind of started in the playoffs and has now leaked over into this season. And, the shooting, I don't expect him to shoot 46% from 3 this year, but his shot looks so much better just from an aesthetic standpoint. He looks so much more confident on the 3. And I'm no longer like terrified when he takes a 3-pointer. I'm actually expecting the 3 to go in, which is probably the best compliment I can give him. What you mentioned about with Mitch being a monster and being able to guard at the level. So I mentioned RJ like figured it out during the playoffs and it's carried over. The Cleveland Cavaliers were sending both Mobley and Allen to box out Mitch during the playoffs, and it just didn't work. Like, the Knicks would then be like, all right, then Julius Randall is unimpeded to the ball, or Josh Hart is unimpeded to the ball. It was only when Bam Adebayo got involved, and Spo had a strategy of any offensive rebound Mitch gets, you're fouling him and we'll live with his free throws. He's been a revelation this year. He's been dominant. Look, Dennis Rodman to me is the best rebounder of all time, or one of the best rebounders of all time. He's averaging more offensive rebounds per game, or I guess a higher offensive rebound percentage at the moment than like peak Dennis Rodman. And that's like the best compliment you can give him. He has created such an advantage at that portion of the ball. And you add the fact that he's actually like putting his like really long arms in passing lanes now. And it's almost like it clicked, which is the coolest thing about watching your younger guys develop to a certain point. You have 2 starters that are starting to take a leap this early into the season, which is cool. As far as Jalen Brunson, I've talked to some people close to the team that both he and Josh Hart were just exhausted from playing FIBA all summer. So I didn't
think about that.
I'm not surprised if he and if both of them are off to some slow starts. It's really just like some bunnies that he's missing, because like his 3-point shot is there, but he's missing on 2s at a rate that is due for some regression, which honestly applies to Julius Randall too. He got off to a historically bad start. And like an article came out the other day that he was operating at 70%. Like, he wasn't cleared for 5-on-5 contact. He had ankle surgery during the off season and wasn't cleared for 5-on-5 until training camp. So, look, the Knicks shot quality score is they should be 5-3. RJ missed 2 games with a knee injury and they lost both. So they could potentially be 5-3, could potentially be 6-2. This fan base is very optimistic about this team, though, and I'm expecting a W. I'm hoping for a W on Sunday. The matinee portion of it makes it a bit of a wild card, and I guess that's the last question I'll ask. How confident are you coming into this game?
It's funny you mentioned the matinee part. I feel like the Hornets do not do well in matinee games. I wonder if there's some kind of website that kind of posts win-loss records and like
in matinees. Yeah.
Hornets probably not too well. But no, I don't have much confidence that the Hornets are going to win this game. Could they win this game? Obviously, sure. I think it's going to be a physical game, like I mentioned, on the glass. And I think with Mark Williams and Nick Richards, they're not the perfect matches to keep him off the board, but they are definitely physical bodies. And they are guys that live in the paint, live on the block. The Hornets are going to get their points in the paint and at the rim. But Mitchell Robinson could be the guy that swings it in the opposite direction and frustrates them. So it's crazy to think that not Julius, not RJ, but maybe Robinson is the X factor in this game.
It's been like this since the Cavs series, though, that he has been such an X factor. Every game this year, it's been like they can't stop Mitch. They cannot stop Mitch. As much as RJ and what he's doing is so awesome, Mitchell Robinson's been the best Knick this year. Like, as much as impacting winning is concerned, it's far and away what he's doing is tilting the balance in their favor in games that he's playing. So, yeah, I'm hoping that what we said the other night was like, don't screw around. Like, you should win a game at home against a team that you're projected to be better than. It's the matinee thing. Like, I know you said the Hornets aren't good at matinees. A Sunday in New York is just so unpredictable about how people are going to show up, what people did on Saturday night, what version of the teams are you going to get? So, we'll see what happens on Sunday. Richie, I went through this whole podcast without mentioning that you and I are rivals. We're talking about Mount Rushmore rivals. We're rivals in another sport, Major League Baseball. We have a bit going on, me and the Knicks Film School audience, that I bring up baseball on every single one of these pregame pods and how long it took to get up to it. I thought I was going to get to the very end without doing it, but I brought up Steve Cohen, so that timer unfortunately got hit. I'll just 30 seconds. How you feeling after the Braves and the season that they unfortunately ended in disappointment?
Yeah, this was the year that I thought they were going to win it all. And baseball is probably the most unpredictable sport out of all like the major ones. I feel like when you go into the playoffs, it is really any team that is kind of like firing on all cylinders. The momentum is the thing. I'm not gonna bring up the fact that they had, X amount of days off before they started their series. Like, I don't think that's the sole reason as to why they did not win their opening round against the Phillies. But overall, regular season, best team in baseball, playoffs, it doesn't matter. Like, if they didn't show up, they didn't show up. And, the pitching was a little bit of a struggle, and they're going to have to fix that next season. But it's funny. There's a lot of Mets fans down here in our area, a lot of transplants. And I asked a couple of them the other day, like, which team do you dislike more, the Braves or the Phillies? Both of them said the Braves. I'm like, I cannot stand the Phillies. Like, if you were to ask me Phillies versus Mets, I would say I dislike the Phillies more. I don't know if it's like the fan base, not necessarily the team per se, but the fan base. I don't know. Mets I can deal with on a certain level.
So, see, there's a reason. And I'm assuming that the fans that you spoke to that are transplants,
yeah,
they're close to my age. And we grew up with the Atlanta Braves, Chipper Jones, Andrew Jones, Ryan Klesko, the Tom Glavine killing the Mets when he was a Brave, and then when he was a New York Met. We went through the trauma of all those division titles and falling short in the 99 series, that any frustrations that the Phillies caused in the late 2000s, I was more frustrated with the Mets than the Phillies after those wars. Like, because the Mets, I thought, had better teams and just collapsed down the stretch. And here we are. The Braves are now doing it to us again, and they're dominant. And I think where you're more frustrated with the Phillies, there's an actual rivalry there.
Yeah.
There's 2 playoff series that they've won when the Braves have been the better team. So, the Mets, unfortunately, do not have that experience of actually they've beaten the Braves once in the playoffs, and it was in 1969.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. Apologies, Knicks fans. Richie got me going, but that I can perfectly explain why I have much more hate for the Atlanta Braves, or more frustration with the Atlanta Braves, than I do the Phillies. But and all things being equal, I'm kind of more upset with my team at the moment. So we'll see what happens with them in a different sport. Thankfully, I have the New York Knicks, and we have this basketball game to look forward to distract us on Sunday. Richie, thank you so much for joining me for another pregame pod. Quick, before we wrap up, tell people where they can find you on the internet.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, at Richie Randall. Our podcast at Buzzbeat Pod. Our episodes are on Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your podcasts. Occasionally, we do go live after games on YouTube. And so Knicks fans, if you're ever feeling bad about your team, just come over and listen to Buzz Beat, and then you guys will magically just feel better about your team. That's how it works.
You know what? Perspective. I like that. Knicks fans, go get perspective is what Richie's trying to say. Richie, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.